Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be discussing the Ruy Lopez, beginning after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and specifically we're going to be talking about this move g6, which some people call the fianchetto variation, but really I've heard it referred to as the Smyslov variation, or the Smyslov defense, beginning with this move g6, and how exactly are we supposed to face this with the white pieces if we want to get some sort of advantage. Well, anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on that notification icon. Well, the primary response that I've always had against a move like g6 is to immediately play d4. Basically, whenever somebody doesn't move another piece out, d4 is kind of my default response. So if they make some passive move like h6 or d6 or any kind of pawn move in this position, I'm going to try to open the position and take advantage of the fact that I have a little bit extra development here with white. So d4 is a supernatural move. It's also one of the top picks according to the engine. This should give white some sort of advantage. So the main line here is, of course, e takes d4. And now the move that I always played, and it's certainly one of the top like one or two moves in the position, is this move bishop to g5. This should yield some sort of advantage for white. Now what's interesting is one of the main lines in this bishop g5 would be something like you're trying to induce like an f6 move. And after f6, you would play bishop f4. And then sort of the main idea here is if they play some developing move that doesn't make sense, or even one that makes sense, like if they play a move like bishop c5, for example, what you're going to do is you're going to play c3. And you're going to sacrifice this pawn. And this position is supposed to be major advantage white. Now, this is just based on sort of purely positional reasons. Like, you have the center of the board, you have more space, and your opponent has a lot of weaknesses in his position. He's got weak light squares and actually at this point, like, very weak dark squares. Weakness on f6, etc. So it's more important that the position is opened and that you have more development than it is that you're down a pawn. The pawn means next to nothing here. So just to give you an idea of just like some computer lines here, we would have something like dc3, knight c3, d6, for example. You could just castle a6 and then b4 is supposed to be the move. After b4, it's supposed to be pretty close to like decisive advantage white. Sort of the concept here is bishop takes b4, bishop takes c6, b c6, and then queen a4. Again, just we're playing a la Morphy. The only thing that matters is tempo and development and making those aggressive attacking moves. Bishop c3, queen c6 check, bishop d7, of course, to defend the rook on a8. And then after queen c3, white has a decisive advantage, even though white is still down a pawn. So here's the basic idea is if black plays something like h6, to prevent further infiltration. Actually, h6 is not a crazy looking move in this position, believe it or not. Like, for example, like you can't develop, like you can't just play like knight e7 because like the pawn on f6 hangs, so there's issues. F5 has its own problems because of course it gives away the g5 square and it hangs the rook on h8. So it's actually really difficult to find any kind of forward moving move here for black that doesn't hang something, hence h6. But here you just break through with e5. And, of course, two different pawns can take this, but it doesn't quite work either way. Like fe5, knight takes e5. The point being, if d takes e5, we have queen e5 check, just picking up the rook on h8. This is clearly decisive advantage white now, both materially and positionally. And if we play something like rook h7, trying to hold it together, the computer gives knight d7, rook d7, rook ae1 check, king f7, and then just taking advantage of the fact that this king is kind of out and about on f7. We're going to play rook e3 with rook left ideas. Note, we are actually still down a pawn, but the point is g5, bishop g3, and now f4 is coming. Black can chop some wood, like rook e7, knight e7, but now f4, g4, bishop h4, queen d7, queen f6, king e8, rook e1 is completely winning. And again, this is all like a really long computer line, but it gives you an idea. Like even the engine can't figure out a way to hold the pawn without the other engine killing it. So basically, if a computer is not going to be able to hold it against a computer, it's going to be very difficult for a human being to hold it against a human being in general. With any time you have compensation for the material, it's usually even harder for a human to defend that with black than it is for a computer. So if a computer can't defend it with black against best play, a person definitely can't defend it with black against best play. So basically, after a move like bishop c5, you can play c3 and just be very, very confident that this position is major advantage white. But after bishop f4, I did have one personal game. I've actually played this position a couple times with the white pieces against a guy named Dan Voge, who liked to play this as black pretty frequently. So it had to be in my repertoire just for that reason. So I'm going to have like two of our games kind of in this video just to give you an idea. But we had one game continue Bishop H6 here, and I, of course, exchanged and weakened the dark squares and just took on d4, and I should just enjoy a slight edge here pretty much no matter what I do. It's interesting to note that after castles, knight e5, knight c3, the computer just gives this already as, like, decisive advantage white. Now, needless to say, I'm not a machine myself, so I didn't play this absolutely perfectly. I kind of came up with the right idea. After c6, bishop e2, d6, I came up with the right idea, but I came up with the wrong move. I played h3, and he could have apparently equalized with this move f5. I just wanted to point out this little tidbit. And h3, interestingly enough, is the right idea. It's just the wrong move to do it, because there is actually no threat of a knight coming to g4. Like, if a knight comes to g4 right now, I could just kick it. So the computer wanted me to play something like queen d2, king g7, and then, like, pawn to f4, knight ef7, and now finally h3. It just gives us decisive advantage white. It just thinks white's killing here. But I got kind of lucky. My opponent didn't really take advantage of it. He played actually queen c7, and then we sort of transposed. I played queen d2, knight hf7, and then king h1, rook e8, rook a d1, b5, f4, knight d7, bishop f3, bishop a6, e5 was completely decisive, apparently. I'm breaking through on c6, but then, of course, I gave a little bit of a back anyway. After b4, I played the idea knight d5 followed by e6, which gave me an advantage, but and I did eventually win, but I just had, I had knight on c to b5, takes, and then e6 just completely winning, so... that would have been the easiest way to finish up that game. So, that's the problem with showing some of my own games in these videos. I make a lot. I play the opening really well, but I make a lot of tactical mistakes. So, but anyways, so going back, we have this bishop g5. That's pretty much how we're planning on playing against this move pawn to f6. The alternative here is something like bishop to e7. And white just enjoys some sort of advantage after bishop e7, knight on g to e7, knight d4. And there's actually quite a few games starting sort of from here. I have this game, Shirov versus Andrieksen, which continued castles kingside. And then we have knight c3, a6, and then the correct move here is bishop e2. I have another game that I personally played here, where I played bishop c4, and bishop c4 isn't supposed to be nearly as good. Like, bishop c4 isn't strong. But, like, in the game that I played, like, I got lucky. My opponent, again, continued with not the best continuation. Like, knight e5, bishop b3, c5. And I got very lucky that everything just kind of simplified in the middle, and I just ended up with a pretty clear advantage, just after bishop d5. But apparently, like, bishop c4 has got some issues. Like, you're really not supposed to play bishop c4. And the correct move is just something like bishop e2. So we have bishop e2, d6, and then h4. And this was apparently already, like, major advantage white between Shirov and Andrieksen. And this is why bishop e2 is just better, because bishop e2, d6, h4, and already you've apparently got almost a winning advantage, just with the threat of h5. So the game continued, knight d4, queen d4, knight c6, queen e3, f5, trying to get stuff going, but, h5, we're just cracking open this weak black king with all these squares around the king weak, dark squares, light squares, everything. So f4, queen d2, g5, g3, knight e5, takes, castles queenside, and Shirov just kind of handles this attacking position pretty beautifully, just opens everything up, just keeps going after the king, and black just couldn't defend. I mean, at many points, black's position was indefensible, but just eventually, black just decided to call it a day. There's too many threats. Rook h7 followed by rook g7 check, followed by just like h7, h8 is a threat. The rook can't leave the back rank because rook c8 mate is a threat, and you obviously can't play knight takes h6 because rook h7, rook h6 is a threat. So it's not worth playing this final position on. But that's kind of the long and short of this bishop e7, knight e7, knight d4, is we should just have some sort of advantage here. So that brings us back to kind of this last line after e takes d4. Since the bishop g5, f6, bishop f4 lines, or I even knew people back then that played like bishop g5, f6, bishop h4 is also similar to the bishop f4 lines. Again, white should have some sort of advantage, with these ideas of eventually playing c3, etc., or something else. Why not just sack the pawn? I mean, it's a really interesting question. Why even bother with bishop g5? We have all these weak dark squares. Can we just play sort of almost like a Smith-Morra type gambit, like with c3? But in this case, it's just really good. Like, there's all these weaknesses around the dark squares. We have the development lead. We have the tempo lead. Does c3 make a lot of sense? And the answer is yes. Actually, c3 is given as major advantage white already, sort of according to the computer, if black just accepts the sacrifice. Like, if black plays dc3, knight c3, this is already major advantage white. And there's this game, Jones versus Sandypan, that was played back in 2015 that continued with h6, castles kingside, bishop g7, bishop d2, knight on g to e7. I'm assuming bishop d2 is prep because it happens to be the best move. Queen c1, a6, bishop a4, g5, and then knight d5 was already decisive advantage white. So basically the idea is after castles, just bishop c3, going after those dark squares, f6, bishop b3, now going after the newly weakened light squares. So you see white managed to get this concession anyway, and not only that, he's gotten a few more concessions. These light squares are just absolutely terrible, and this bishop is just kind of like a living joke. And then we have just a ton less space in the middle of the board. If this doesn't compensate for a pawn, basically we can never sacrifice pawns ever again. so yeah, basically this position is just a winning position for white. So I mean, the game continued king h8, h4, it's standard breaking down of the position. So we have this g4, knight d2, knight e5, d6 takes, knight c4. Most of these moves were at the very least good enough to get the victory. And at no point was white ever in any real trouble. He just kept going after the now, just every single pawn in black's position is actually weak. So it wouldn't make any difference like how many pawns black has. But in this case, black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns versus white's 4. There's just you need at least 3 more 3 more pawns to to be okay somehow, I think. But yeah, all of black's pawns are hanging, so it's absolutely ridiculous. So rook d1, bishop c3, and he finally snaps up one of them, and then he sacrifices his queen for the bishop, which ends the game on the spot. Of course, the point being, even just king takes bishop, rook b4 picks up the queen on b7, and we can just resign. The game is just over. So queen to g7 just ended it. Queen g7 resigns. That was Jones versus Sandypan, played in 2015. So this concept of c3, like what is black supposed to do? Well, there is a little bit of theory here. Like, you can play a6. This is actually pretty reasonable. And then we have bishop a4. And I ran across this kind of interesting game. Like, bishop a4 is possible, and bishop to c4 is possible. So I ran across this game after bishop a4. I ran across this game, Carlsen versus Andrew Tang, played on Lichess, which, I don't know, I'm assuming it was a blitz game. I don't know exactly what it was. But the game continued bishop g7 from Andrew. We have c takes d4, b5, and then we have bishop to c2. We have d6, and now we have this move, castles kingside, which is a mistake from Carlsen. And then Tang completely equalized with bishop g4, and Tang actually went on to win, which is cool. Way to go, Andrew. If you're watching, Andrew, way to go. So, anyways, I knew Andrew when he was a kid. He was a very strong 9-year-old blitz player. I think the only tournament game we ever had, I think I actually won. So. There we go. But yeah, Andrew did really good there with bishop g4 and equalized, and then eventually went on to win. Now, what's interesting, though, is castles isn't a very good move. After h3, this position should still just be advantage white. White has the 2 center pawns, and you have that pawn duo. You should just be a little bit better. So h3 is just advantage white. So as far as the theory goes, this is kind of what we should do if we continue with bishop a4. It is also possible to continue with bishop c4, and it's kind of the same idea. We just want to play c takes d4 in the middle if black just does nothing, and we should have some sort of advantage. This was played in Drishchuk versus Mamandarov, played back in 2018. Bishop g7, c takes d4, d6, castles kingside, knight to f6, knight to c3, and then we have castles, we have d5, we have knight e5, knight e5, d takes e5, bishop e3, knight e8, rook c1, knight d6, bishop e2, f5, f3. So you can see clearly here that white's just a little bit better. White has more space, white has a better center, and white was able to eventually turn that into a win. That was Drishchuk versus Mamandarov, played back in 2018. So this position should just be considered advantage white. So This move, pawn to c3, just instead of bishop g5, totally reasonable. Like, we don't necessarily need to poke for more weaknesses with bishop g5 and then play c3. We can just play c3, and these positions should also be somewhere between slight edge to major advantage white, and white just enjoys some sort of advantage here. And this is basically how we need to play against the Smyslov variation. Either you need to play this d4 followed by bishop g5, or you need to play d4 c3 and just play it as a pure sacrifice and get some sort of advantage with that. But either way, white should just be enjoying somewhere between a slight edge to a major advantage against this move pawn to g6, which is probably the reason we don't see it very much in high-level competition anymore, because people do have access to Stockfish, and they understand that these positions are very, very good for white. Anyways, I hope that you found this video helpful. I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games, and thank you very much for watching.